Okay, welcome to this quickfire guide to the Eduqas Anthology. It's not going to teach you everything that you need to know about all 18 poems, but it will teach you the basics for each of the poems. It's just meant to be a snapshot, so don't treat it as everything that you should need to know before these exams, just something that allows you to revise the key points and therefore to be aware of the main kind of narrative and the main issues to explore, really. I'm going to spend 30 seconds talking about each poem, which will be a challenge because there's so much to say about each of them, but I want to keep the video fairly short. So there's 18 poems, 30 seconds each. That means I've got 9 minutes to get through the whole anthology. Could be a bit of a challenge, but we shall see. Okay, so I've got a timer on the right hand side here, and that's going to track my progress, and we'll see if I can do this in one take. Okay, so we're going to start off with the Manhunt. The Manhunt tells the story of a man who has come home from war and he's trying to be supported by his wife. It's told from her perspective. It describes all the injuries which he faces, and it starts off with the physical injuries but then moves on to the mental ones, and it's about how she tries to help piece him back together and discover the man that he used to be. The PTSD is the main idea in this poem, and it allows it to be expressed in terms of the unexploded mind, that eventually something's going to trigger him and set him off, and only then will she come close to discovering the man that she used to be when she can understand what he's gone through. Sonnet 43 is about pure and eternal love. Elizabeth Barrett Browning describes how she thinks about how many ways she loves her husband, and there's so many that it seems infinite. She loves him in daytime and nighttime. She loves him in the same way that she loves God, in a sense of purity, and she praises everything about their relationship. She loves him even more passionately because of the fact that she fell out with her parents and she was disinherited by them, and so even after death her love will become perfect and pure and infinite because it's no longer restricted by mortality. London is Blake's take on the problems of poverty, and he describes wandering through the streets and seeing the problems that poverty causes in society. He describes hearing the sounds of suffering, and in particular he describes how poverty traps them in terms of mind-forged manacles. It chains them down. He blames the church and he blames the government for the suffering that people face, and he says that poverty will trap them down the generations so that the poor will never have chance to escape, and compares that to a blight and a plague at the end. The Soldier is about how England is something worth dying for and facing up to the possibility of death. Brooke never made it to war, so he's a little bit naive in the way that he wrote it, but he says that England raised him like a mother and therefore he wants to protect it, and if so, he's willing to die for it if necessary. By the end, he says that if he does die, he will effectively become almost like a heartbeat in the mind of God, and that he will be at peace under an English heaven, and that will have been something that he considers worth dying for. She Walks in Beauty. Okay, now what you need to know about Lord Byron is he was something of a Lothario. He had many relationships, but he sees a woman at a party and sees something different about her. He says her beauty attracts him in a different way. She's got grace, she's got poise, and he sees her as being almost pure, and he's attracted by that purity. He's also attracted by the fact that she's a dark-haired beauty compared to the usual blonde-haired beauties of the time, and he describes that love as being pure and innocent. Now the question is whether you believe him or not. Next one is living space. Okay, living space compares the problems of the poor to the houses that they live in, and just like the houses can collapse because nothing is flat or parallel, the lives of the poor can collapse as well, and so the whole structure can lean dangerously and they're never safe and secure. Someone has squeezed their lives into a tight spot, just like this stanza in the middle, and these people and their lives are compared to eggs at the end because they can crack and break, and the only thing that keeps them going is their faith in God at the end. As Imperceptibly as Grief is about Emily Dickinson, who shut herself away in her room for years and years and had no contact with anyone, and she describes that loneliness as creeping upon her like grief. And there's lots of patterns of light and dark in the poem. Basically anything to do with darkness means sadness and misery, and anything to do with light means a momentary fleeting point of happiness, but there isn't much of that. And she gets so used to the pain of darkness and loneliness that any happiness becomes almost alien to her, and eventually her happiness and her prospect of it disappears. Next one is Cozy Apologia. Okay, this one Rita Dove is talking about her husband and how effectively he's a great husband and she's almost embarrassed to be as happy as she is. She compares him to a hero, like a knight in shining armour. She describes how the modern age has got no time to think, and yet it's our past that shapes us in terms of who we are. And getting towards the end, she describes their relationship, their connection. They're both writers, they've got common ground, and so she's happy, she's content, and she fills this stolen time with him because he's worthwhile and she appreciates it. Valentine tells the opposite side of love. It tells you how love can go wrong, and that it's not about superficial ideas of red roses and gifts and satin hearts, but things like an onion can represent love because they're plain but they've got many layers, and actually if you scratch away the surface then you can find the truth within. And effectively love can go wrong. There's a real sense of bitterness and anger in this poem, that their relationship went wrong and it became quite possessive. It's fierce, it becomes confrontational, and so that anger led to that relationship's demise. A Wife in London tells the story of a husband who dies in the far southland, it is described as, and the wife is at home sitting waiting for news. She sits at home in the fog, which represents her unhappiness, her misery, until she receives news of his death from a messenger, a telegram. After that, the fog becomes thicker because she's even more sad, and then she gets a letter from her husband afterwards explaining that he was looking forward to coming home, which is really ironic because they'll never get to have that happiness. Death of a Naturalist is how Seamus Heaney describes his loss of innocence as a child. He uses the idea of him discovering frog spawn to remind himself of how that innocence was lost, because when he was younger he didn't know what the world was like, and in particular he didn't know where babies come from, about sexual reproduction, and he talks about how his teacher educated him about the frogs just like he was then educated later about children and therefore lost his innocence, and when he's older he feels guilty about having stolen the frog spawn from the frogs. Hawk Roosting's about power and control. The hawk sits at the top of the wood because it's in charge, it's got nothing to challenge its sense of authority. It talks about how everything is designed to help it, and it thinks it's almost like a godlike figure because it takes the ideas of creation and it holds them in its feet, and it can take life away if it wants, a bit like a god. It's got nothing to restrict it and control it because it's an apex predator, it's the top of the food chain, and so by the end of the poem nothing can challenge its authority. It does what it's like, it's regular and it's controlled, just like the poem. To Autumn is about appreciating autumn and what it gives to humanity. In the first stanza it talks about how the sun works with autumn almost like friends to ripen things which are in the fields and grow them. The second stanza talks about how we can harvest those things and how we can gain things from nature, and sometimes it takes a little bit of time to do that. And in the end it talks about how things are passing in terms of music. It talks about the songs of spring being very distant, but they will come around again, and so we look forward to the next cycle. In Afternoons it talks about how your independence is lost because children take away that independence, and the couple seem to be quite bitter about their relationship having dwindled and faded because their wedding, as represented by the photo album, is lying forgotten in a corner, and so they've given up their own happiness, their own independence, because their children have become really demanding and have dominated their lives. And so Philip Larkin is trying to say that effectively children are not for everyone because you can lose your independence. Dutch at Decorum Est describes from a first-person perspective Wilfred Owen, he served in World War I, about the horrors of war, and he describes how war takes everything from humanity. It takes away your happiness, it takes away your hopes, your dreams, and he saw his friends die in front of him, burnt alive from their lungs because of the gas. By the end of the poem he tells you that effectively nothing is worth dying for, and the lie that soldiers have been told about dying for their country is wrong, and he's seen why it's wrong with his own eyes. In Ozamandis, we get this story of power again. So a traveller comes from an antique land, ancient Egypt, to tell Percy Shelley that he's seen a statue which has crumbled into the sands of Egypt. And this statue represents the power and the empire of Ramesses II. And so just like the statue, his empire collapsed. And so the message of this poem tells you that nothing lasts forever, and that no matter who we are, we can't beat time. When you get to Mamet's Wood, we're talking about World War I. Owen Shears describes how farmers dug up the remains of soldiers from World War I, and they're described as being very, very fragile and easily breakable. The earth is almost acting as a protector to these remains in tribute to their sacrifice because they died as brothers in arms, almost arm in arm. And so by the end he's saying that when we dig up this past, this message from their absent tongues, we have to listen to that message of the past to not cause these wars and to learn from the messages of history. Excerpt from the prelude describes how when we are growing up, we have to effectively learn what life is about and learn about our connections to nature. He describes how he's ice skating with his friends in the Lake District, and this is about them discovering their place in the world. But when you try and discover your place in the world, there are dangers, there are problems, there are fears represented by the tumult, the alien sound, the mountain which hangs over them, and so that happiness kind of a little bit dies as you get older. And that's it. So that's our 9 minutes done. I hope you found that quite useful. There's a little link here to our website and our Twitter page where you'll see more information designed to help you learn and study the Eduqas Anthology. But that was the 18 poems, a quick summary of each in 9 minutes. Thank you.